Good morning, everybody. This is the Freedom to Learn broadcast, a new broadcast about raising free people. And I am excited this morning to have Kerry McDonald with us today. Kerry is an author of a book called Unschooled. She also has a list of distinguished positions. She also writes for Forbes. She is a fierce advocate for parental control over the educational process for children. Also has a post as a senior fellow with the Cato Institute, which is a renowned institute for freedom and liberty, and just a true freedom fighter for parents. I love it because this is something I'm trying to educate myself on as time goes by. And speaking to experts, people that have already thought this through, is good for me and it's good for my audience. So, Kerry, thank you for joining us today.
Oh, I'm so glad to be here, Chris. Thanks for inviting me.
You know, one thing I wanted to ask you about at the top is just, I noticed that in one of your articles that you wrote, you talked about an African-American family that was deciding to homeschool because they wanted to shield their child from bad influences of what they considered to be culturally insensitive public education system. And I just want to say that, you know, what jarred me about that is that number one, you had an African-American family, and homeschooling is largely seen and stereotyped as being not for people of color, being for a very specific subset of families, religious, white, maybe affluent, and that doesn't that doesn't meet reality, does it?
That's right. We find that homeschooling, and of course, I just should say that what we're doing right now through this pandemic is not typical homeschooling. You know, we see these headlines, and myself included, adding them that this is a homeschooling moment. But it is important to say that this is really an artificial version of the real thing, where we're all disconnected from physical community. But yeah, in the typical homeschooling environment in this country, which educates about 2 million US students, the homeschooling population has become increasingly diverse in all sorts of ways. In the African-American community, you find, for instance, that the rates of homeschoolers doubled between 2007 and 2012 to about 8% of the overall homeschooling population. For Hispanic homeschoolers, it's a quarter of the population, which is more reflective of the larger demographics of K-12 students. So it is becoming much more demographically diverse, much more geographically diverse. Urban secular homeschooling is probably the fastest growing sector of homeschooling, and a much more ideologically diverse. People choosing to homeschool for all kinds of different reasons, but national statistics showing that the top reason that families are choosing to homeschool is concern about the environment of other schools, including peer pressure, bullying, substance abuse, and so on.
So you just mentioned that what we're doing right now is not homeschooling. So I have my 3 kids upstairs right now, and I feel like I'm a homeschooler this week and last week. We've got them on Khan Academy and whatever else we can find, and we're piecing together something. The district is sent us something yesterday letting us know that they have figured it out. They're going completely digital now, starting next week. If you don't log on between 10 a.m. and 1 p.m., you're considered truant. 10 days missing, and they'll send out the police for you, or they'll send someone out, just like normal school now. So what's the difference, though? You're saying this is a homeschool moment, but we're not really homeschoolers right now. What would you say is, like, well, how are you making that distinction?
Right. So I think most homeschoolers would tell you that they spend more of their time outside of their homes than inside of their homes, immersed authentically in the people, places, and things of their community. And the idea that now we're all isolated at home and kind of sitting around the kitchen table feeds into the stereotype of homeschooling, but certainly not the reality of it. And it's a stressful time for everybody, for traditional homeschoolers as well as those new to this environment. I mean, we're all facing tremendous disruption and stress and anxiety at this time, and it's incredibly challenging for all kinds of families. I would caution families against thinking that this is what true homeschooling is like, and say, gosh, who would ever do it? Who would ever do this? On the other hand, I think it can give a glimpse of what education without schooling is. Particularly now that we have such tremendous that are becoming available for free during this pandemic, that really can open up so many more windows and doors into new experiences and ideas that we may not otherwise have had a chance to explore.
You mentioned the resources that we have. What I find as a parent, like right away, is that we're just overwhelmed. Like within the last week or so, having your kids immediately at home, of course, there's a million resources, but there's a million resources, Kerry. I mean, like literally there's a million. How do parents who homeschool make sense of narrowing it down just to what makes sense for my kid?
Well, at this time, again, we're thinking about what we're all experiencing. I think there's some really great resources out there on just talking to your kids about what's happening. For example, yesterday I just listened with my kids to the But Why podcast that's put on by Vermont Public Radio that had a wonderful episode geared towards children. Their whole podcast is for kids. And I thought it really presented these ideas and what we're all experiencing in such a calm way, and saying to the kids, look, your adults too don't know what's going on. This is new for everybody. And then there are all these other videos popping up. What are viruses? How, the history of epidemics? How does the human body work? So that could be, an entry point, that something we're all curious about and don't have much information on. But you're right, there is this sort of information overload, resource overload. And so hopefully, one thing I've been saying lately, and maybe you'll find this too as you get through the school curriculum, it sounds like maybe you have some more parameters around where you are in terms of how long the kids have to be logged in. But for families across the country, many of them are finding that their children are able to get through the curriculum much more quickly because these distractions that we find in a typical school day are minimized. And then it leaves a lot of unstructured time for kids to hopefully be able to pursue these interests and these passions. They could take a virtual tour of 2,500 museums around the world. They could watch streaming symphony performances that are online for free now, or just explore any other interests that they might have. And that might be the way to start encouraging young people to discover their passions and some new skills and talents.
One of the things that I wasn't ready for was just how different it would be in their behavior by being home, right? Like not being in like school, just, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but this is just one guy's experience. It feels as though they're more hyped up because of all of the stimulus of like really loud, aggressive kids when they come home, usually from school. Now that they've been home for this time, I've noticed just kind of like a more calm group of kids. Like they don't seem to be as erratic and, obnoxious. I didn't expect that as part of them like being home, because you always hear the opposite. You always hear the socialization thing. Like, how will your kids be socialized if you don't send them to school? Is that something that you find that other parents might see as a benefit, that maybe your kids do their behavior change for the good? It's not like they're anti-socialized. They're actually socialized the right way.
I think that's right. I would say that none of us are being social at the moment. We're all really disconnected from each other. So that is, again, artificial. But I do think that even though most families will be delighted to return to their normal routines of work and school, there will be these families who, through this experiment, living and learning at home, will find what you're finding. Their kids are calmer. Maybe the lack of bullying improves their mental health. Maybe they're enjoying reading again because they're reading books and materials that matter to them as opposed to what's being assigned. Maybe their curiosity is reemerging as they're able to pursue some of their interests and use these online resources as a guide. And so there will be, I think, an uptick in families maybe who were curious about homeschooling or alternatives to school or virtual learning, who will say, you know what, I don't want to send my kid back post-pandemic.
Mhm.
Let's see if we can get a glimpse of what real learning without schooling looks like when we are truly immersed in our communities.
How do you think it's going to work for families? We talked about how diverse it's becoming to homeschool, but how do you think it's going to work for families practically that don't have a lot of resources? I mean, this is generally seen, I think, oftentimes as something for the affluent or people that have resources. I've seen a few cases where that's not necessarily true. How do you see it as working for families that maybe aren't the most advantaged families?
Well, I think you do see again in the demographic data of homeschoolers, certainly in the last decade, has become much more socioeconomically diverse and more reflective of the larger American society. So I think that there is that possibility. I think that because there are so many more resources for homeschoolers in terms of classes or self-directed learning centers or hybrid homeschooling models, that can make homeschooling accessible to families who otherwise wouldn't have had access to this. An example is the Da Vinci Charter School Network in California, in the Los Angeles area, which is a hybrid homeschool program, free public charter school, where young people attend a kind of a brick and mortar learning center 2 days a week. And then the remaining 3 days, they're at home or they're taking other classes or other programming through their community. So it's this hybrid model. And I think we'll see more of that. And I think demand for those kinds of things may increase after this experience, as well as more families want some of these alternatives.
Yeah, there's been a lot of conversations in the last couple of days about what's going to happen the moment the school doors fly back open again. And there's a lot of joking online. I've called it out in a couple of places that it gets under my skin a little bit. This idea of, well, parents just won't be able to wait to get rid of their kids again. Like, aren't you guys going to be glad when we reopen the schools? And it feels unfortunate that anybody would feel that way about their kids, like being home. Like I posted something asking, why did you have kids? If the idea is that, like, for several hours of the day, I just can't be with them. I can't even imagine being with them. But when the doors open, it's just a reality that I think a lot of people are going to go back to traditional public schools. But there's going to be a portion of parents who have decided that that's not for them because they've had this experience, this opportunity to do something different. Do you feel like there's going to be a new way for those parents to connect with each other, like to start building community around the idea that this could be a bigger movement now of people?
Yes, I think, again, it's important to acknowledge that this is stressful for so many of us, that, you have families completely displaced, you have parents in some cases that have lost their jobs.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think a lot of this feeling of, oh, we just want to get back to normal, send our kids back to school, underlying that could be a lot of this tension and anxiety and fear that we're all experiencing right now. So I do think that's part of it. But I think that there will be these families who are intrigued by a different way to learn and start to see that schooling is only one method of being educated. And now, again, with these incredible digital resources that we're all being able to see firsthand, they may say, wow, there are other ways to be educated. There are other ways that I can help facilitate my child's education. Already, I'm seeing in some of the Facebook groups dedicated to homeschooling, seeing parents of conventionally schooled children joining these Facebook groups. And it's likely that some of them will remain there after this. And that's another way of kind of building community and gaining encouragement and support, particularly if parents have been intrigued by a different way of learning. And this is a moment to give it a try.
So you make a challenge. So your book that you wrote is called Unschooled, right? It's about unschooling in a way, which I think we need to like define terms for the public. Like we have traditional public schools, district schools, we have hybrid schools, we have micro schools, and then we get into the range of feeling like school may not be the most natural way for kids to learn, period, which is it's a big leap for a lot of people, intellectually speaking, to like, we've all been trained over 150 years to think public schools and schooling is just the natural order of things. I think history tells us something a little different than that. But what is the challenge that you make just on that premise? What's the challenge that you make on the premise that it's just natural to like give your kids away at age 5 to this state system and you come out the other end 12 years later, a fully fledged citizen. Like, what's your challenge to just that premise?
Right. Well, I just start by saying that, my overall goal is to expand education choices for families, that I want families to be able to choose the best educational environment for their children and their family. My educational philosophy, or the philosophy that I think is something that I tout and advocate for, is self-directed education, or what we would consider unschooling. So I'll persuade you, try to persuade you to think about self-directed education as a particular educational approach. But again, the idea that, expanding education options for families and acknowledging that there's all kinds of ways to learn and be educated, that's the number one priority. But in terms of self-directed education, or this idea of unschooling, is really separating education from schooling and recognizing that humans are innately curious. When you look at young children, they are incredibly creative and imaginative, and they have this desire to learn and discover and explore. And as Dr. Peter Gray, who writes the foreword to my Unschooled book, who's a psychology professor in college and unschooling advocate, he says that these natural human drives for learning and discovery don't magically disappear when a child turns 5 or 6 years old and gets sent off to school. We turn them off with our coercive system of schooling. And so again, this moment of being separated from school, to the extent that young people are able to disconnect without truant officers coming to their door if they are not logged in at the appropriate times, to the extent that we can disconnect, I think it gives families a glimpse of what rekindling some of those curiosities and that love of learning could look like.
Corey DeAngelis says hello. He just logged in. He sees us talking here. You mentioned Dr. Gray. It's funny because if I look to my right now, which is your left, if I look to my right on my bookshelf, I have this book, Free to Learn, by Dr. Gray. I got it from Goddard College. I don't know if you know about Goddard College.
Yeah, sure.
I'm currently a student at Goddard College in Northern Vermont. And I don't think that people know that there's things like there's a pathway, an educational pathway, if you are unschooled or homeschooled or whatnot. I think the fear is, how will you get into college? Like, how will you know year to year that you're making progress? Like, what are the tests? What are the things that let you know? What do you think about the fear in unschooling and people thinking about unschooling, that it'd be possible for your kid to get very far behind and you not know it? You could end up with a 16-year-old who doesn't really know how to read or something like that. What do you say? I know you say the natural curiosity that people have, and they'll get there, but there's just a really big fear that they won't get there. I mean, what would you say?
Well, what I say in my book, and I say whenever I'm asked this question, is that I think parents have the ultimate responsibility to ensure that their children are highly lit. I think that the responsibility for ensuring that your children are on you as parents. So if your children are in school or home. So unschooling doesn't mean not using resources, not using curriculum, trying to version or this top-down expectation that we associate with conventional schooling. And I like to use the example of my older daughter, who loves to take all 4 of my children, and my passion about Korean language. And she developed this passion, was taking martial arts classes in the community, and became really interested in Korean history and culture and language. And so she takes an intensive Korean tutoring program 3 times a week with assignments and a curriculum and tests. But this is something that she's driving. It's not something that we've imposed on her. And I think that that's something that a lot of people will say, well, that can't be. My kids would never be that self-directed. And I say, well, you don't know that because they've been conditioned to be taught. And if we allow young people to explore their interests, and then we as adults connect them to resources to facilitate those interests, I think we would be surprised at what people are able to accomplish.
Yeah, I think, again, the stereotype that, we have to be honest, that exist is the stereotype is that your kids have crayons and they're writing all over your walls all day long. Like, unschooling is just about having wild children who, just kind of free range children is what I've heard. And there's no rules, no boundaries. They just do whatever they want. There's no bedtime. There's no rules, no kind of like parental, authority and guidance. What you just described is a little bit different than that. Not a little bit, but a lot. We have a question here from, go ahead. I'm sorry. No, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I mean, I think unschooling, like any educational philosophy, has a wide umbrella and includes a lot of different practices even within it. I think, you will have families that do provide that much freedom for their children to choose bedtimes and choose what they eat and all of those things. But I think most unschoolers, you'll find, and what I've discovered in writing the book, are somewhere more in the middle. And then there is this, really important point that unschooling is not unparenting, that adults play a really critical role in facilitating self-directed education.
That is huge. Like, unschooling is not unparenting. I'm going to put that on a t-shirt, just so you know. One of the basis of this broadcast and other things that I'm writing right now is really an exploration of parents' role, their responsibility as parents and as the president of their child's educational development, and their rights. I call them the 3 R's of parenting. And so with the first one, you kind of hit on that, the role. What's the role of a parent? Do you really know what your role is? Because handing your child over and handing their brain over to other people every day seems like an abdication of your role in some ways. But you don't want, it sounds judgmental when I say that, but it is really how I feel. Like, God gave your child one person, two people, to really be the president of your growth and your development, and you can outsource that to the school system, but don't be upset when the results aren't good. Anique London has a question here. How do you motivate a middle school age child, 8th grade it looks like, to do something other than device usage? I've tried other options in self-directed learning, but have been unsuccessful.
This is a hard question. I assume that it is related to what we're all experiencing right now. So maybe, can chime in if this is needing larger clarification. But if it's what we're all experiencing right now is being at home with our children, digital technology is a lifeline right now for parents and children. And so it is tricky where we may typically as parents be wanting to limit technology use, particularly if we find that it has a negative impact on our children. We are in a little bit of a predicament now where we rely so heavily on technology, and especially for those middle school grades where kids are feeling really disconnected from their friends, and to be able to play Minecraft multiplayer with their friends, or to FaceTime or go on to Google Hangouts. I think that's really a way to ensure that we have some sense of community when we are all disconnected. So if it's what we're experiencing now, I would say this is again an unprecedented experience for all of us, and just kind of let it go in terms of how much technology usage. If it's more broadly speaking, if you find that your children are on technology a lot, particularly if they're in school and you find they come home or during school breaks, all they want to do is be on their devices, I think one thing to remember too is that for young people today, so much of their lives are scheduled by adults, and they have very little time to be in control of their surroundings and of their world, even less so than when I was a kid and we kind of went off in the afternoons and did our own thing and without cell phones and without checking in all the time with adults. And young people now don't have that. And so often video games or these other technology resources can be the one place where kids are in charge. They are in control of their surroundings, and they're able to sort of decompress from a life that's really highly scheduled and supervised by adults. I think you find as young people kind of de-school and move away from that schooling environment, technology use may be less. And I do, again, say, because unschooling isn't unparenting, if you think there's a problem and it's not healthy for your children, then you should absolutely intervene and create some limits. But again, right now, I would maybe loosen those limits just because technology is so critical for all of us.
I think a lot of it could deal with where you live too. Because I mean, in where we live, our kids can run out the back door and just kind of roam like out back. If I were to show you out my window right here, we've got deer and trees and stuff, and there's room. I think we felt a little different when we lived in the city. When we lived in Minneapolis, it felt a little different to just let our kids run out the back door and have them explore. So it feels like you're kind of at a little bit at a natural disadvantage if you're in a place like Chicago or New York or other places where there's so much congestion and things are so close and there's more to worry about. But I'm also told that 12-year-olds ride the subway in normal times in New York, and go to the museums or go to somewhere on their own at 12, which astonishes me because as a parent, I mean, I can't imagine that with our kids happening. But I like what you're saying right now because it does bring us back from the stereotype that it's just a free for all. The thing that you still have to be a cognizant parent and set some limits, but also let your kids have this freedom and the unstructured time. We might take it too far in my household, Kerry, just so you know. My kids have like a lot of free time. And if you try and cringe on their free time just a little bit, hey, can you take the trash out or something like that? It's my free time. You hear it from them. And I think we were pretty indulgent about it.
Well, one story that's emerged from this pandemic that I just find fascinating and is relevant for this discussion of unschooling is the story of Isaac Newton, who was a young college student in the mid-17th century in London when the bubonic plague hit. And colleges were closed. Everyone had to self-isolate. He left for the countryside and was in self-isolation for a while. And he called it, or it was called later, his year of wonders. He, during that time of self-isolation, free from professors, free from curriculum, was able to explore and make some incredible scientific discoveries, some of the most amazing scientific discoveries of his career and that are most meaningful to us. He discovered the gravitational force. He discovered integral and differential calculus. He created the theory of optics during that time away. And so I think, again, we're looking at how much we're losing right now, understandably. There is a real sense of loss. But I think if we can also look at this as a chance to be away from our typical routines when we're always on the go and consumed with our daily activities, this could be an incredibly creative and productive time for parents and children alike in ways that we may yet fully embrace, fully understand.
It sounds like you're making a challenge on more than just the schooling part. It sounds like you're making a challenge on the way that we parent also. I heard you say a couple of things in there that struck me as important for inquiry. Like one of them around how the scheduling, how we overschedule, overmanage maybe. Maybe we're keeping up with the Joneses in a way that's unhealthy. Am I right to say that part of this is also you're making, I don't want to call it a critique, but you're making some sort of suggestion about a different way of parenting also?
Yes, I think that this moment is a chance for us all to sort of step back and slow down and reconnect with our children in ways that we may not have otherwise had a chance to do. And so in that way, it's an incredible and extraordinary opportunity to gather together as a family in these more authentic ways when we're all really struggling with how to process this experience. And then again, I do think parenting is a part of this. And it's hard right now because we are all so stressed. Maybe we're trying to work and be on conference calls or webinars and our kids are yelling in the background, or the show and their iPad just ended and now they're interrupting you. And it can really make tensions rise and is, I think, an extraordinarily difficult time to parent at this moment. But yes, I think that the more that we can get to know our children, give them some more freedom, become curious about what they're curious in, and help to connect them with resources, which again, right now, are many of which are free online for us, could make this really difficult situation much more rewarding for everyone.
I am struck a little bit by, I'm going to move on to a question from Erica Sanzi here, but I am struck a little bit about this outside thing because it's very easy in our household. We have a device for every kid. It's very easy for everybody to be on their devices, headsets, devices, all sitting around the house. And just because we're doing social distancing doesn't mean that it's all inside.
Right.
Doesn't mean that you're not supposed to go out and get fresh air, right? And get out of the house. And but I don't think that the resources are as clear about how do you explore outside. What is there to learn? Like how to use that time as maybe learning time, an extension of your learning time, not just go outside for a few minutes, get some fresh air, and then come back inside and get back on Xbox or something. Erica has a question here, looking for recommendations for active middle school boys who resist reading and whose sports seasons have been canceled, right?
Yeah.
So you have active, this has got so much going on in it. Middle school boys who are normally in sports and are not in sports right now and are cooped up in the house. And a lot of boys are just, I don't want to be stereotypical about this part too, but just reading can be a challenge sometimes to get boys to just sit down and do it. So there's a lot in that question. Do you have any recommendations?
Oh, wow. Well, I think this is something that all of us are struggling with right now. I think this resonates with so many parents, particularly where we aren't really able to go to playgrounds at the moment, and a lot of parks are closed. I know that my middle school age son is skateboarding in front of our house on the street when he can.
Yeah.
So finding those moments, but yeah, I think all of us are spending more time inside now than outside for a variety of reasons, social distancing being one of them, also because nothing's really open. So, walks together as a family, I think can be helpful, and also remind us that while we do have so many of these digital resources available to us, thankfully, many of which for free, those offline family experiences, I think, will be what we really look back on and cherish during these moments of lingering over breakfast together, or going for a walk together, or reading a book together as a family. I mean, this is another interesting note for families looking who may have reluctant readers. For example, because as I mentioned earlier, I was so fascinated by Isaac Newton and his year away during the epidemic. I started reading a biography of Isaac Newton myself, and then I found an ebook through my library online to read to my 11-year-old son about Isaac Newton, and that opened up a whole different discussion about Newton's laws and all of these other interesting ideas. So that could be a way of approaching it. Again, in between your own work at home, which many parents are struggling with, is going on to your library and borrowing an ebook on a topic that's interesting to you, or that you think might be interesting to you and your children, and reading that out loud. And sometimes that can be a way of bringing in these reluctant readers, and also be a really meaningful experience as a family.
You've mentioned a couple of times now, like, Isaac Newton. Are there other famous autodidacts in history that caught your attention? There are others that really made you really curious about how much this has been normal in history?
Well, of course, Leonardo da Vinci is probably one of the greatest, polymaths, and was self-educated. Let's see, who else? I mean, certainly even before compulsory schooling really began in the mid-19th century, you have, most of kind of these historical figures were self-taught. You can go back into history and just see that the steps that people took to become self-educated. There's an interesting book called The Intellectual Life of the British Working Class. It's a thick historical book, but it talks about these, what we would consider sort of these working class individuals in Britain before compulsory schooling, that had a real sense of self-improvement and self-education, and found ways to connect with each other. Jimi Hendrix is a great example of, again, somebody who was completely self-taught in guitar. So there are these wonderful stories. Yeah.
You know what I find interesting about this discussion, like we mentioned at the top that you work with Cato, You're largely in groups that are considered either libertarian or conservative. But for me, what's interesting about this is how often unschooling and homeschooling is considered a right of center or conservative thing when it has a lineage and a history that's much more complicated than that. Everything from Marxist ideology about school systems being intended to transmit the ruling class's mandates for people to create sheep. Basically, that's part of a Marxist philosophy of education. You have people like Ivan Illich. I don't know if you've
I love him.
so like Ivan is a really interesting case study, and somebody. I mean, he was a priest. He was very much, I think, a liberation theologist. Very much of the people. And what was it? It was 71 or 72. So this is a very long time ago, right? That he wrote Unschooling.
Right, 1970. Yep.
1970. Okay, so that's at least what? That's 50 years old. Is that he wrote that again in the middle of a progressive explosion of what could be with education and alternatives or whatnot. How did this thing come to be seen now, where we are now, as being really this right-wing plot to privatize schools, for instance?
I don't know that homeschooling, it's such a diverse experience for everyone. I don't know that it would be fully considered right wing. I mean, I think, again, you see a lot of urban secular growth in homeschooling, families that are completely dissatisfied with a standardized one size fits all test driven schooling model, really embracing homeschooling. But you bring up Ivan Illich, and I write about him extensively in the Unschooled book. My favorite quote of his from Deschooling Society was, schooling prepares for the institutionalization of life by teaching the need to be taught. And I just think that captures what I'm suggesting in this idea of disentangling education from schooling. Because if we can move away from this conditioning that we've all been accustomed to, of being taught, of waiting for others to tell us what we need to know, and instead encourage those natural curiosities that we see all young children exhibit, then we may be surprised at the other areas of life where we have some more agency, or opportunity to kind of pursue our own destinies, really, in ways that we may otherwise not be able to. But just a little bit more on the history of the modern homeschooling movement. There was certainly this flood of interest in alternative education in the 1960s and 1970s. You had Ivan Illich, you had some other writers like John Holt, who wrote his books, How Children Fail and How Children Learn, in 1964 and 1967, which were bestsellers. You had Paul Goodman writing Compulsory Miseducation in the early 1960s. So you do have these writers that reflected a lot of the social unrest that was happening in the 1960s and 1970s. But the modern homeschooling movement actually began in the hippie left. It was the countercultural left that was keeping their children out of school, often on communes, and rejecting institutionalized education. And so it really began in the left, and then, of course, grew through the religious right throughout the 1980s. But I think now you'll see more and more diversity ideologically and politically in the homeschooling ranks.
Do you feel like other issues suck a lot of the oxygen out of the room, like charter schools and other schooling models, magnets, charters, or whatnot? So getting parents to the point where they are educated about this alternative, like you could possibly be your child's teacher yourself. We haven't done a very good job of educating the public of that, even as an alternative, a possibility.
That's a really good point. I'm hopeful that we'll see more of that. I think it's important to include homeschooling as one of the many options when we're pushing for school choice and education freedom. I think we will see more of that. I think especially because we have more of these hybrid models for homeschooling. So homeschooling in many ways becomes the legal lever to enable parents to reassume control of their child's education, to offer more freedom and flexibility. But homeschooling in its modern practice involves much more immersion into these other programs and community experiences. So it isn't just one stay-at-home parent teaching around the kitchen table. It's much more of a community experience that's becoming increasingly accessible to more families. And I think that will continue to grow. We also see a lot of interest and growth in the micro school movement. And many of these micro schools are in-home programs that, 8 to 12 kids in a home, but are often connected to a larger micro school. I think of Prenda Micro School, which is a network in Arizona that's expanding beyond that state as well. And that's free for many families through Arizona's charter schools and education savings accounts programs. So I think those kinds of innovative models will continue to expand, especially now that we have a taste collectively of education without schooling.
Yeah, there's a school that I mention all the time in the Bronx. It's an Afro-vegan school started by a New York public school teacher. And when their kids became school age, they decided they didn't really want to put their kids in the schools, in the public schools. So they started something like a co-op, like you would think of a food co-op, but it was an educational co-op. Afro-vegan, became multicultural. Other families they have a rotating volunteer schedule for teaching. They grow their own food. Their kids, plant the food, grow the food, eat the food, cook the food. And it's a peaceful community of educators. It's not really a school. It's an educational learning vehicle, but it's not really necessarily a school. And that to me struck me as, okay, see, now if we had help, it would be easier. Like if we had a collaborative of people saying, you take shift A, I'll take another shift, which is what you do in food co-ops. So that makes a lot of sense to me. So I want to get to this point about closing the choice gap, because you wrote a piece about the choice gap, and I think it's a really alluring idea to think about what the choice gap is, because so much of what we're talking about right now goes back to where we started, which is people very often feel like they don't have the resources, or they don't have the life kind of situation, the advantages to be able to pursue this as an alternative, unschooling as an alternative. But before we get there, you've said this thing a couple of times, which I'm finding interesting, about testing and test-driven and standardized testing. And my head is starting to spin with my friends on all sides of the aisles about testing, because it feels like there's now been a convergence, left, right, and center, against standardized testing as a way of measuring anything. I get it. I understand it. I hated tests. I was a poor student. I was an excellent learner. Poor student. Hated testing. Hated tests. I joke about it all the time that I really have no love for the people of Iowa, because growing up in the 70s, we had the Iowa Basic Standard Test or something that they used to give us. So every time I would see the word Iowa, I knew it meant hatred in my heart. But as a parent who believes that our kids have been historically underserved by a state system that does not like to be accountable for the money that it gets, for the compulsory nature, like we are forced by law to either do this or something that seems out of reach for us. So I worry about anti-testing in that it's only one test a year. It's for the purposes of the government knowing how they can report to the public where $700 billion is going, whether it's making any type of, in my lifetime, I can't remember specifically conservatives ever being okay with, let's just give them $700 billion and have no way of knowing whether or not performance is aligned with that money. Help me with the standardized testing antipathy right now. What do you think it's ruining, or it's driving too much, or it's where is it damaging?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting you bring up a little bit of the history, right? So in the wake of Johnson's war on poverty in the 1960s, there was a flood of federal money and state money into education, into schooling, and that sort of set us up for 2001 and No Child Left Behind, where all of a sudden there was this sense of, well, we need to be accountable now, or hold people accountable now for all of those dollars that are being flooded into education. And so that kind of led us into this more standardized and, again, test-driven schooling environment that I think we've seen over the last couple of decades.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the issue that many families will say with testing is this larger belief, and you hear it especially from teachers, certainly the teachers I've talked to, in particular in urban districts that I write about, in fact, in Unschooled. They feel like their creativity is also being crushed because they're so focused on making sure that everything they do is aligned with curriculum standards and set up for success on the test. And it diminishes a lot of their individuality as an educator and their ability to improvise and be creative. And then I think that also spreads to the children, who are also then not able to take the time to be creative and imaginative. So it leads to, I guess, maybe a more sterile learning environment than maybe even it did when I was in school, pre No Child Left Behind and others of us.
Mm-hmm. Do you feel like the concerns about, so I get it that you don't want it to narrow curriculum, drive too much of the process, change the way that kids are learning, and tilt the entire learning process towards performance on a test. At the same time, do you feel like there's a compromise to be made then if we're going to let the schools off the hook for performance or for accountability to outcomes? Can we loosen up some of the $700 billion that they get then so that parents who don't feel like they're being well served and have never been well served by the schools can get out of the compulsory nature of this unaccountable system?
Well, I think that's right. I think if we start allowing parents to be the ones to show accountability, we'll have much greater success and much more variety. We see this with some of these education choice mechanisms like tax credit scholarship programs and education savings accounts and voucher programs, that if parents are put back in charge of some of these tax dollars, they are very good at deciding, what is a good education environment for their child. And if a particular school or learning environment is not working out for them, they will leave. And there you have the accountability. So I think that's absolutely true that these kinds of education choice mechanisms can help to redistribute that $700 billion a year in taxpayer money and put families much better back in charge of their child's education. Do
you have any sympathy for the argument that people make about what happens when you pull your kids from the schools? Like, what happens to the schools that they leave behind? What about the other kids?
Well, I think if we allow families to leave and find the best educational environment for them, then everybody should be able to win in that way. And if we say, well, then what happens to these other schools that are left? It's as well, if parents aren't happy with those schools, then they should leave as well. I just think that by re-empowering parents and sending a message to parents that you have the power, you have the authority and the ability to provide the best education for your child, finding the right environment for your child, that's an empowering message. And if families do not feel like the local district school is doing that, then they should be able to leave that.
It feels like that's the real threat to the system, is that parents, given the option, would take it. Right. So the goal becomes to make sure that parents never get the option, because for a fact that they would take it. In your piece that you wrote about the choice gap, you have this, I did not know this, outcome from the EdChoices schooling survey in America. And it says that 4 out of 5 kids attend public schools, but only half of public school teachers and less than a third of parents half of public school teachers would send their kids to a private school if they had the opportunity, or they would pick another alternative if they had. Right. And only a third of parents prefer to send their kids to a district school.
Exactly. It's a huge.
That's astounding.
It's a massive choice gap because, as we have more than 80% of young people today in an assigned district school. Fewer than a third of their parents preferred that they are there. So it's a massive choice gap. And I think your point earlier about if the only thing keeping families at a local district school is coercion and compulsion, what does that say for our values as a free society? I think there's ways, again, of redistributing tax dollars and making sure that children have a high quality education, but it doesn't have to come from a local district school if that's not what families want.
That's so powerful. How do we make that point over and over again, that if the only thing that's keeping you there is coercion, like force,
Yeah.
because the statistics bear out that you want something different. You're being trapped, right? And there's no shame in trapping you either. I think people are pretty aggressive about openly stating that if given a choice, parents would take the choice. How do we make that point over and over again?
Well, I love talking about the history of compulsory schooling statutes in this country. So I'm in Boston, Massachusetts, and Massachusetts enacted not only the first compulsory education law in the 1640s, but the first compulsory schooling law in 1852. And of course, one of the architects for compulsory schooling was Horace Mann, who wanted to create this system of common schools. At the time, Boston was experiencing tremendous immigration due to the potato famine in Ireland and elsewhere. And so there was this rapid social change with Irish Catholics streaming into the streets of Boston at the same time that was sort of threatening the dominant Anglo-Saxon Protestant ethos of the time. The Massachusetts state legislature, for example, wrote, "Those pouring in upon us in masses of thousands upon thousands are wholly of another kind in intellect." And so it was really an anti-immigrant moment, and that led to this kind of compulsory system of mass schooling, saying we have to Americanize all of these immigrants and put them into these schools. But Horace Mann homeschooled his 3 children with no intent of ever sending them to these common schools that he mandated for others.
I heard somebody say that before. Is that really true? I mean,
his biographer, Jonathan Meserly writes about this. Yeah.
I read in John Taylor Gatto's piece something that I can't find a source for, which is he said that public schools were thrust upon people in Massachusetts at gunpoint. And apparently there was a colony or somewhere that they literally had to do it at gunpoint. I can't find the I can't find the source.
I have not been. I've read that as well from him. I think it was in Barnstable down in Cape Cod that he writes that, but I too have not been able to find that source. Yeah.
It's a great story if it's true, but like so many things, you need a source. The thing about the homeschooling in Horace Mann, though, I think is fascinating because it lives on today. This is a good idea for those kids, but not for my kids. That's such a part of like the hypocrisy of education right now. You mentioned the history of education and you love talking about it. You said, but this is what I find so ironic. I find it ironic that you could go through 12 years of public schooling and never be taught the history of public schooling. Does that make any sense to you?
It's true. Right.
You never think critically about the institution you're actually in. And the irony is they're supposed to be teaching you how to think critically about everything. But the history you just mentioned, I'm sure is obscure to most people. They don't know about, for instance, the influence of German culture on our schools, our early school leaders or whatnot. That is the basis of it. But when we talk about things like choice, for instance, now in modern times, you have a lot of stories now that are being retold that it comes out of the segregationist history of the 1960s, right? That's the sum total of school choice, the school choice story. How do you think we start expanding the intellect of the public around the real history of parental control of the child's education process?
That's a really good question. I think a lot of it is just inspiring parents that they can do this. I think there's really been a strong sense of disempowerment with families becoming marginalized in many schools and being taught that they are not capable of teaching their children. I mean, I remember watching when my kids were really little, watching PBS. And even seeing on some of the messaging there, it was like, you got to get your kids ready for kindergarten. Like that is your one job, is to get them ready, and then let us take over. So I think some of it is just reminding parents that they do have the capability of doing this, that these are their children. And they don't have to necessarily be the ones educating them as we are with homeschooling, but they do have the ability to find the best education environment for their children. They know their children better than anyone. You probably remember too, Chris, a sad study that came out, I think about a year ago. It was a joint investigative report between the HuffPost and the Hetchinger report around school districts weaponizing child protective services against sort of non-compliant parents. And it was particularly true in low-income communities and in minority communities, particularly in New York City. And so, I mean, talk about bullying parents who were questioning, you know, should their kids have this label, or should their kids be put on this medication for ADHD or so on. Having that kind of true government force coming on them, true intimidation. Those are the kinds of practices we really need to fight against to help to re-empower families.
It's amazing that you can be arrested for things resulting or revolving around school. Parents, what they call residency fraud, you know, using the wrong address to get your kid into a school. We've had parents arrested for that. Now, I understand that there are rules in life, but it seems to me that that would be like an infraction where you would handle it a different way than arresting moms. Like the optics and the reality of that is so silly. The weaponizing child protection because you're not being compliant. I don't know if you saw the case of the homeschooling parent who the district said did not turn in the right paperwork to notify them. So she had her kids taken. They showed up at the door and took her kids right out of the house at that moment with no preparation at all for the kids or anything. And she really caught charges for what turned out to be the school district's fault. They had the form, but they had forgotten somehow that they had the form. It's amazing to me. So we are wrapping up. We're coming to the end of the hour here, but I do want to ask you about getting back to this choice gap. In the piece that you write about that, you write about a parent. I might butcher the name, but it looks like her name was Shaylana Graham, who really wanted to put her kids into an alternative learning environment. And the price of public or private schooling wasn't working out. For them. Do you have preferred policy levers for how we help the parents that do want to make a practical path towards alternative education for their kids, but the resources are hard?
Well, I think there's two things. One is that in that Forbes article, Shaylana says, you know, she was looking at private schools here in the Boston area, and they were, you know, like $30,000 a year. And she now has 3 children. It was just prohibitively expensive for her, but she did say she would be willing to pay something like $7,000 a year. So I think low-cost private schools, there's still a role for that. I think that's, again, where these expanding networks of micro schools can come in, because many of them are a third to a half the cost of available private options. So there's that piece. But then I think, at a policy level, it's expanding voucher programs, it's expanding tax credit scholarship programs, and especially education savings accounts, which enable families to have more flexibility in how they're spending those education dollars. And after getting a glimpse of what life without schooling is like now, they may say, oh, I can pay for some tutors, I can pay for some books, I can pay for some classes. And education savings accounts would give them that ability to do that, as opposed to vouchers, which would just go to school tuition at another school. So I think if we're thinking about preferred policies going forward, it would be things like education savings accounts that give families ultimate flexibility.
Excellent. I see somebody coming in your back there. Kerry, I want to thank you so much for joining me today. I would love to have you come back again and talk about several things that came up as we were talking today. It was in my mind how we talk more about the parenting aspect of this, and even what we ended with, some of the policy levers for making sure that there's support, not just for other kinds of schools, but for other kinds of learning situations. And I know in Minnesota, we have a couple of credits that are specifically for that I think are important. I want our listeners, our viewing audience, everybody who's watching this, I want to say thank you to you all also. Kerry McDonald is an adjunct scholar at the Cato Institute Center for Educational Freedom and a senior education fellow at the Foundation for Economic Education. She's also the author of Unschooled, Raising Curious, Well-Educated Children Outside the Conventional Classroom. You can pick it up on Amazon. I prefer that you do it through Kindle. I don't know how the author feels, but that's what we call sustainable reading. I love the fact that I have thousands of books, and Kerry, I'll have your book now in my Kindle, and I'll be able to highlight passages from it and steal liberally. Of course, I will give you the citation. You can also find articles and writing from Kerry in the Wall Street Journal, Newsweek, NPR, Education Next, Reason Magazine, City Journal, Entrepreneur, and of course, we already mentioned Forbes. Thank you so much, Kerry.
Oh, it was great to be with you. Thanks for having me.
Appreciate it. Bye-bye.
Bye.